Hello, I'm Wendy. Today we're painting flowers and we're using some experimental techniques in the background. And the flower that we're painting is a hellebore. I'm certain they're a favourite flower for lots of us, and being going towards the end of February now, then they're certainly in bloom. They're looking beautiful in my garden, and here is just a selection of some photographs that I've taken. I'll be working from some of these during the video. I'll start by painting a simple white flower and then move on to look at some coloured ones. The paintings will all have experimental backgrounds using clingfilm and maybe a little salt. I have done some similar work on experimental backgrounds before, and I'll give you links to these videos in the description box below. I'm using a different masking fluid today. I usually use the Winsor and Newtons, and I do like that, but I have found this, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, Pebeo drawing gum. I like this, it's going on really nicely, and the good thing about it too, it doesn't have a childproof top to it, so you can take it off easily. It's also got this sort of blue colour to it, which I'm not finding too intrusive when I'm painting. And I find now using this then that you'll be able to see it a little bit more clearly when I'm putting the masking fluid on. I'll put a link to it in the description box below, in case you're interested in maybe getting some. I do recommend it. As I said, it's going on quite nicely. I'm putting it on fairly thick here because I just wanted to make sure that I did cover it properly. But you can use it a little bit thinner than this, I've discovered as well. As you can see, I'm rinsing my masking fluid brush occasionally now in some very diluted washing up liquid. I find this does protect the brush. And when you've actually finished doing all the masking that you want to do, I would suggest that you wash your brush in some nice warm soapy water. Otherwise, masking fluid can be really awful on brushes and can ruin them. Don't ever use your best watercolour brushes. This is the reference I'm working from. It's a very simple shaped hellebore, a white one, as you can see. What I've done on the drawing is I've added a couple of little buds as well, just to add a little bit more detail to the picture, a little bit more interest. I'm actually going to use this flower as a reference for the centre. I rather like the purple. I thought of the anthers and the stigma and the stamens and all those things in the middle will be nicely set off with the purple. So I'm almost finished here masking in this flower. It's these last little bits can be very tricky, these very thin lines with the masking fluid. I suggest you use a really tiny brush to do that. I've showed you this masking process in detail on this flower. It gave me the opportunity to talk about a few other things, and I thought you might be interested, particularly if you don't use masking fluid a lot, to see how we do this. I won't be doing this again in the video, don't worry. The whole reason for going through the masking out process is so that you can put on a background, and you can do it quite spontaneously and mix your colours without having to carefully draw around the petals and the little buds. I'm going to show you this process again in detail. I'm going to show you how I'm putting on these colours. I won't be doing that later on in the video, but I think it's important to show you that you've got to keep all these colours very wet. If you feel you're working too slowly, then you can wet the paper with some clean water before you put your colours on. Work around the picture so that everything does stay wet. I got my colours mixed up ready. As you can see, I'm putting a yellow on to start with. You can see I've got some colours mixed here. I quite fancied doing yellows and purples and greens. Clearly you can choose your own colours. As I said, as long as you keep everything wet as you're working. So the green I've mixed from Prussian blue and burnt umber, and the purple I've used Dioxazine purple and ultramarine. Dioxazine purple is a Cotman colour, it's quite inexpensive and it's a very versatile colour. It can make really nice purples and you can put different blues with it, so it's quite an interesting colour to experiment with your mixers. I'll put a link to it, it'll be down in the description box if you fancied having a go with it. So as you can see now, I'm using the colours that I've mixed up ready to put on here. I'm trying to keep everything nice and wet. What you'll find is that you'll probably run out of colour as I am, so you will have to do a little bit of mixing as you go along. Another good tip is, if you're finding it is drying out, is to maybe use a little spray bottle. A very light spray of water can keep everything damp. You just want to make sure you don't spray too much so that the colours merge too much, because you can end up then getting that horrible mud that we all talk about in watercolours. This paint has got to be kept wet, otherwise you'll see what I'm going to do is lay the cling film over it, and if the colours aren't wet then the cling film won't have any effect. So this is why I'm stressing this. I always find that it's a good idea also to put some of your darkest colours around your point of interest, which in this case is the white flower. So you're going to be setting off the darks against the lights to make it more attractive and give it more of an impact, if you like. And the cling film here, just lay it on and maybe dab it down gently. If you dab it down really firmly, then you're going to get more of the texture when you pull the cling film off. You can see the shapes appearing there. You may want that, or you may want to lay it on a little bit more gently, so in some areas you're not getting that effect. As I said, it's all very experimental. This is the fun of it. You don't know what's going to happen, and once you take the cling film off, you've got to work around what you've got. It's a really nice, expressive way of painting. So when everything was dry, I removed the cling film. As you can see here, I've got two pictures that are very similar. You saw me demonstrating putting on the masking fluid and the background wash on the one on the right. I was also working on another one on the left-hand side, hedging my bets, if you like. I wanted to show you this. It's a very good tip for you. Once the cling film comes off, you're going to rub out the masking fluid from the flowers. But what I found is quite often you do get these very wet drops of paint on the area that you've masked out. And if you start rubbing there, you're going to dirty the picture because that little area is wet. So just get a little bit of tissue and dry them off. You may want to put the hairdryer on as well. I'm using a mask away rubber to remove the masking fluid. You can use your finger or a regular rubber. You can see here this was coming off really well, and I felt it was better to pull it off, because otherwise, as I was saying earlier, you can make sort of the marks from the residual paint that was left on there if you're not careful. There is a little bit more masking to do now. I've drawn on the middle bits, the stigmas and the stamens and the anthers, and I'm using a very small masking brush here to mask them out. They need to be masked out because they're going to be light against the darker background of the purple middle of the flower and of the shadows. I then added some of the purple mix to the centre of the flower when the masking fluid was dry, and also, as you can see, I've just done the suggestion of a very light yellow just in places on some of the petals, because that's what I was seeing on my reference photograph. I reinstated some of the little stems that hadn't worked very well with the masking fluid. I did this with white gouache, which is a lifesaver at times, and then I just put a little bit of a mid-tone green on the stems and also over the tops of the little buds here. I've mixed up a nice watery transparent shadow colour, and what I'm going to do now is paint the shadows on the petals. I'm placing the shadows in a way that separates the petals based on changes of tone rather than the pencil line, which will be rubbed out. There's a hard edge where the petals overlap or join, and then with clean water I'm pulling out some of the paint to give a soft edge on the other side. And this gives a really nice effect, I think. It gives a nice feeling of form to the flower, and it looks very transparent as well with these nice watery shadow colours. It's easy in watercolour to build up too many layers and to lose the transparency of the paper. Now if you're painting a white flower, it's easier to keep the transparency because you're using the white of the paper for part of the petal. But we'll be moving on a little bit later in the video and looking at putting some shadows on a colour. We're going to be painting some pink flowers. So if you hold on, we'll be looking at that a little bit later on. I'm working in a similar way here to show where the petals fold over, where you always get this little bit of a cast shadow. When everything was dry, I rubbed off the masking fluid that was on the centre of the flower, and what I'm doing here is just suggesting the yellow colour for all the middle bits there. You might want to change that and do a light green. If you're working from a reference, then use the colour that you're seeing. There were a couple of shapes on this picture that I really didn't like, particularly this one that I'm working on now. So I thought I'd show you this bit because people are always interested in how to adjust watercolour. None of these colours were particularly staining, so I could lift them out. And what I'm doing here is just gently adding some water to those shapes and bringing the colour out, the watery colour, into other areas. So you can see that the colour from those dark areas I didn't like is sort of dissolving into the rest of the picture. I mopped up a little bit of the extra colour, and this being an experimental picture made it a lot easier to adjust. You could sprinkle a little bit of salt in there. Also, you could put a little bit of cling film on there as well if you wanted to. Quite often you see the cast shadow of the stamens, as you can see in the reference on this photograph that I'm showing you here. And it's nice to paint these on your picture sometimes. I'm doing this with that very pale watery shadow colour, very carefully with a small brush. I think it looks very effective. It's easy to overdo this stage, and I think the simpler you keep it, the better. This was another painting I was working on of the hellebores, and as you can see here, I've got a little bit more of a complicated composition with the two flowers and the bud. I like the colours in this in the background. I particularly like that little bit of blue at the top, which just happened because it's all experimental. If you would like templates for any of my drawings on this video or any of the others, there is a link in the description box where you can go to my website and download them. So now we're going to have a look at painting some pink hellebores. I'm not going to be explaining things in as much detail as I did for the white ones. You can see here that I've got two drawings again, and I put different backgrounds on them. And this is the stage when everything is just dried and I'm about to rub off the masking fluid. So when that was done, I covered the flower with a very light transparent wash of pink. This is permanent rose with just a touch of ultramarine in it. You could paint the shadows on these petals wet into wet, but for this particular demonstration I decided to leave this first coat dry, to let it dry, and then you'll see how we put on the next coat. With a stronger version of the same mix, I'm separating the petals on the hellebore in a similar way as I did when I separated the petals on the white hellebores. I think the most important thing here in maintaining the transparency of these flowers is to make sure that that first coat that you put on is really transparent. And then these following washes with the cast shadows should be put on, I think, with as few strokes as possible. I think what I'm trying to say is do try not to fiddle too much. I'll show you some of the mixing here. As I said, the colour I'm using is permanent rose. If you don't have permanent rose, you could use alizarin crimson, rose madder. There will be something in your paint box that you can use, it's not critical, and then adjust it with a little bit of blue. You could use cobalt, in this case I'm using ultramarine. all the petals are being worked in the same way. And then the cast shadows formed by where the petals are folding over are going to be put on, and I'll show you this. I finished this painting off in the same way as I did the white one. I used a dark green for the centre of this one, and the cast shadow of the stamens was done in a slightly darker tone than I used for the cast shadows on the folds of the petal. Painting on the left there is a version of the same flower. I just use a darker pink on it. I think that looks quite effective. I like those two flowers. I'm quite happy with them. As always, I do hope you learned something from my videos. I do enjoy painting them, and I especially like painting flowers as they come into season. I'll finish off this video by showing you how I mounted some of these paintings that I did as small prints. They would also be suitable for making into greetings cards. Bye for now.